Hi everybody, it's Dr. Isom, here to give you a brief lecture on culture and personality. In this lecture, I will be talking about some of the relations that research has established between different cultures and personality of the people in those cultures. I'm also going to talk about several characteristics that have been studied that differ between different cultures. And then last, I'll talk about the Big Five and how the Big Five measures up across cultures. When personality psychologists are thinking about culture and how culture impacts personality, the big question is, how do individual cultures with their social structures, their traditions, their beliefs influence personality? We know that culture definitely influences personality based on prior research, because culture influences the values and the beliefs and the traditions of the people within a culture, which then influences their behavior. But we also know that the behavior of people, when it changes, can also then turn around and start to change the culture. So we know that causal arrow goes both ways. And that's something that personality psychologists need to keep in mind as they are studying differences between cultures in personality. Before we start talking about differences in personality between cultures, we really need to establish what culture is. So what is the definition of culture? It is a group of people's beliefs, values, their attitudes, their cultural traditions. Sometimes it includes different language, the way that they think about the world, even their view of reality, which influences their behaviors, their thoughts, and their emotions, which you'll recognize as the psychological triad. Those are the things that have been studied as being different for people across cultures. As I mentioned, culture can affect how personality is expressed, and with that includes emotion in particular. And Cantor and Zirkle put it nicely when they said, culture determines the very way in which we choose to draw the boundary between what is ourselves and what is everything else out there. When we're thinking about cultures and how cultures may differ, we also understand that there are some aspects or phenomena, some things about all cultures that are the same. There seems to be a common core of experiences or phenomena that people of all cultures, no matter where you live or what cultural group you are a part of, experience. One of these is emotions. Paul Ekman found that universally people experience similar emotions. The way that they're expressed, however, and the way that they are communicated are different across different cultures. The experience of emotion that's universal, that we all have these emotions, that's something called an etic. Etics are things that all cultures share, all humanities share, and that are thought to be part of the common core of being human. Some of these examples other than emotion include how cultures tend to treat their members better than people who are not part of their culture. You might know this as in-group versus out-group differences. All cultures seem to have something that's similar to having a sense of duty or responsibility. Now, across different cultures, a sense of duty or responsibility may mean different things, but all cultures seem to have that common experience. As I mentioned, the experience of emotion, that seems to be a cross-cultural universal. Another one is the idea of personal space. Every culture has a preferred amount of personal space. Personal space is the amount of distance between yourself and another person while you're talking or interacting. In some cultures, it's as close as 60 centimeters. In other cultures, it's quite a bit different. All cultures experience the idea of personal space, so that is an etic. But individual cultures have different ideas about what is an appropriate distance for personal space, and that is an example of something we call ETICs. ETICs are phenomena that are specific to individual cultures. Some cultures, it's quite appropriate to be right up next to somebody when you're talking to them, whereas other cultures prefer to have 1 or 2 feet or even more distance between people who are communicating with each other. So ETICs are the ways different cultures approach those common core experiences of being human, otherwise called etics. And you'll see differences between cultures, ETICs, in their beliefs, in their traditions, in their values, and in the norms that they think are appropriate for behavior within a culture. And in fact, ETICs are the source of behavior and personality differences between people from different cultures. And as a result of that, ETICs have been something that personality psychologists have investigated. Before we start talking about different ETICs, just want to mention why it's important to study cross-cultural differences in the first place. For one, if we understand the reasons behind behavior for people of different cultures, then we'll have a much better understanding of why people from different cultures do things that we may not think are appropriate when we look at the behavior through the lens of our own culture. For example, you see the image of the baby in the baby carriage without any parents around. This was taken in Denmark, where it's quite common to leave babies in baby carriages outside in the cold because there's a strong cultural belief that it's really healthy for babies. And also, the understanding is that there's nothing wrong with leaving a baby out by itself on the sidewalk because that's what everybody does. That is their cultural understanding. That is one of their cultural values. However, that kind of behavior in the United States, we would not consider to be appropriate. And some might even call it neglectful. So ordinary behaviors in one culture can be interpreted very differently in other cultures if there's not an understanding of the culturally different basis for those behaviors. And in fact, there was a case of a mother arrested in New York for doing this exact thing. Turns out she was from Denmark, where this is a perfectly normal behavior. This is something that everybody does in Denmark. In the United States, we have a different cultural understanding, very different ETIC for how we deal with babies who are sleeping while you're in a restaurant eating. So studying cross-cultural differences in behaviors and emotions and thoughts and attitudes will help us to better understand the things that differ and we may think are inappropriate when viewed from our own cultural lens. It can help us to move away from being ethnocentric in judging other people's behaviors. Another reason why we need to study cross-cultural differences and include people of multiple cultures in our research is because, unfortunately, 80% of the subjects that have been involved in psychological research are from only 12% of the world. Most subjects that have been involved in psychological research come from specific types of cultures. And the acronym WEIRD summarizes that. Most of our research has been done on Western, educated, industrialized, relatively wealthy or rich and democratic participants. And unfortunately, that is not the majority of the population. That's only 12% of the population. So it really limits our ability to generalize findings from the psychological research we have to other people in different parts of the world. We really need to expand our ability to conduct research on people of different cultures, different ethnicities, with different values so that we can have better generalizability of our theory and our research in psychology. So now that we've defined culture and we've talked about why it's important, let's talk about some specific ways that personality and culture have been studied. Research has shown that culture affects how personalities are expressed in terms of behavior, thoughts, and emotions. And the ETICs in a culture act like a lens through which all of the world is filtered. So the ETICs in a culture are the way that a person of a given culture interacts and experiences the world. People of a given culture have a shared understanding of what specific behaviors mean, such as leaving a baby in a baby carriage outside of a restaurant. In Denmark, that's a perfectly acceptable thing to do. In fact, it's healthy for the baby. In New York, that is something that could get the mother arrested for neglect. The only reason why we have such different understandings is because the ETICs, the specific values and beliefs and traditions in our different cultures, impose that view on those specific behaviors. There are many cultural ETICs that have been found to influence personality, and I will cover a few of them next. Okay, the first ETIC that I'll talk about is describing a culture as tough versus easy. Some cultures have been described as tough, whereas others have been described as easy. This was originally created by two researchers back in the middle of last century. Not a lot has been written about this ETIC, except that it seems to focus on how easy it is for members of a culture to be successful and satisfied with their lives. Easy cultures are those in which There are multiple goals that members of a culture can attain, and some of them are relatively easy to be successful. And that's opposed to tough cultures where there are relatively few goals that a person in that culture can shoot for, such as finding occupational success. And those goals are tougher to obtain. And when you have a limit on the possible ways that a person in a culture can attain success, that creates a higher amount of stress. The country of Lithuania could be described as a tougher culture using this framework. The picture on the right shows a demonstration by the people of Lithuania to try and bring greater awareness to the rate of suicide in Lithuania, which is incredibly high. It's significantly higher than any other country. One of the reasons why the suicide rate may be high in Lithuania is because it is very difficult there to succeed economically, to be successful in an occupation, because there is a very high rate of unemployment in Lithuania. Arsenian and Arsenian argued that the tougher a culture is, the more stress that's experienced by members of a culture. In Lithuania, in addition to the high unemployment, there's poorer mental health, greater abuse of alcohol and drugs, and a social or cultural norm of excessive drinking, which may be related to the higher suicide rates. All of these factors would be consistent with a tough culture. Another characteristic of cultures that has been studied in terms of the personality of the people in that culture is achievement and affiliation, which was developed by McClelland. McClelland thought that you can assess the extent to which a culture values achievement versus affiliation in its members. And you can do that by actually listening to and determining the stories that a culture tells the children as they're growing up. Cultures that have a higher need for achievement will have a higher percentage of stories that are told to those children that discuss things like resilience and overcoming challenges and becoming successful, much like the Mike Mulligan and his steam shovel story that's shown in this image. Perhaps you remember it from your childhood. McClellan also found that the countries that have a higher need for achievement or higher levels of achievement also had higher and faster rates of industrial growth. And so he hypothesized that those stories that are told to the children when they're very young teach them and contribute to a culture that values achievement and success. However, it could be that the culture who values achievement and success is also more likely to create stories to tell their children that are consistent with those values. So which of those came first? It's kind of a chicken or egg problem. Another characteristic of cultures that makes them different is complexity. Complexity refers to things like how well developed the culture is in terms of its government and its structure of its government. Does it have a currency system? Does it have an educational system? Do they keep records? These are all aspects indicating greater complexity in a culture. The picture on the right shows ancient Rome, which by Triandus' definition would be a very complex culture because it had extensive government systems and educational systems. On the other hand, hunter-gatherer cultures would be very low in levels of complexity. Here's another ETIC. Cultures can be rated as to their tightness and their looseness. And this was something that Triandus and actually Michel Gelfand studied. This refers to how much a culture tolerates deviance from their social norm of what is considered proper behavior. Cultures that are tighter have very restrictive social norms. They require more order, more coordination among members. And because of that, they maintain a higher level of control, self-control, and control over their cultural members. Tighter cultures are less open to change. In fact, when faced with threat, tighter cultures cling to those strong social norms to prevent harm. Looser cultures, on the other hand, allow people to deviate more from what is considered appropriate behavior, and they also allow more expression of individuality. Looser cultures are more open to new ideas. They tend to be more creative, and they tend to be less able to control the behavior of people within the culture. Michelle Gelfand talks about the Goldilocks principle of tightness and looseness, in that you don't want an overly tight culture that's really restrictive in terms of social norms, but you don't want one that's completely loose either, because then you'll have a difficult time controlling the behavior of people in that culture. You kind of want something in the middle, a happy medium, as far as tightness or looseness. This has been examined as far as other cultures in other countries, but you'll see on this picture on the right, it's also been established within our own United States. The colors indicate the tightness and looseness of each state. You'll notice that those on the coasts, particularly the West Coast and the New England states, tend to be the loosest, whereas those in the central part of the United States, particularly the lower Midwest, Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, tend to be the tightest. Do you agree? Here's another interesting ETIC, and that is the extent to which a culture is more head versus more heart. And this refers to the values that a culture holds most dearly, or that the culture thinks are most important. So cultures differ to the extent they emphasize each one of these. Head values or head characteristics are those that include artistic excellence, creativity, valuing curiosity, valuing critical thinking and learning. There was a study by Park and Peterson in which they sent out a survey to over 600,000 people over the internet. It was a self-report survey, and it was asking about the extent that people emphasize values associated with the head versus values associated with the heart. Then they were able to classify cities as to whether they were more head versus more heart. And these were cities in the United States. The cities that had people that held the values of the head higher were those that had better job growth, lower unemployment. They had more diversity among their citizens. They tended to be citizens who were more self-oriented, creative, and innovative. On the other hand, those cities in which people valued things like fairness, mercy, hope, love, religiosity, values that reflect emotional and interpersonal strengths, and being focused on other people, valuing teamwork, those were the heart cities. One of the things to consider is why we see differences in cities like this. Is it that people are drawn to cities that are more oriented towards diversity and intellectual growth and creativity and curiosity, those cities that we would call the head cities, whereas others are drawn more to the heart cities? Or is it that once people are in those cities, that they start to reflect the values of other people, and that people are socially influenced by other people in those cities to identify with those values? Here is an infographic that shows the cities that they included in their study, and Fresno was actually one of those cities. And you can see that Fresno scores much higher in strengths of the heart than in strengths of the head, which would indicate that Fresno values more of those characteristics like loyalty, teamwork, fairness, gratitude. One of the interesting things that they found was that cities with higher average temperatures tended to score higher on the heart scale. Fresno definitely qualifies as one of those cities that has very high temperatures. Funder didn't really speculate why that would be, other than to say that cities that tended to have higher average temperatures tended to have more violence and aggression in those cities. The next characteristic of cultures, or ETIC, of cultures that's studied, is collectivism and individualism. And I'm sure you've heard of this before, if not have already studied this. And this really is just the extent to which a culture places a greater emphasis on the needs of the individual versus the needs of the group that individual is involved in. Individualistic cultures tend to focus on the independence, the uniqueness, and the autonomy of the individual. People are viewed as separate from each other, and needs of individuals take precedent over the needs of the group that individual may associate him or herself with. Again, independence is the most important thing, and self-reliance is also something that's very important in individualistic cultures. People are believed to be responsible for their own lives, and they need to be able to stand up for their own rights. Unfortunately, what happens in these kinds of cultures is that social relationships tend to suffer, and people tend to spend less time interacting in social groups and forming those social relationships. Individualistic cultures also hold self-esteem as really the source of subjective well-being or happiness. The more a person can achieve, the higher status they're able to reach, and the more positive self-regard they feel. Unfortunately, the downside of individualistic cultures is that there is a higher vulnerability of loneliness and depression because of the greater social isolation associated with this epidemic. Collectivist cultures, on the other hand, view the needs of the group that a person is associated with as more important than any individual's needs. So there's a strong focus on social rules and working together as a group, instead of achieving independent success. In fact, there's a saying in collectivistic cultures that the nail that stands up gets pounded down. Another one is that the tallest poppy gets cut first. When you have this kind of a culture where people are so interconnected, the boundaries between one person and another person tend to be a little bit fuzzy. People's self-worth is based on their interactions with other people, their relationships. Greater relationship harmony leads to higher levels of subjective well-being and happiness. And also, it's thought that people in collectivistic cultures tend to experience more other-focused emotions like sympathy. Last, collectivistic cultures tend to regard hierarchies as important, and greater emphasis is placed on respect that's associated with status in a collectivist culture. This table summarizes some of the basic differences between these two types of cultures. Individualistic cultures, they're more focused on the individual in terms of emotions. When they form domestic partnerships or marry, it's an individual's choice of who to marry. Social hierarchies, such as gender, birth order, and age, are not regarded as that important, and neither is social status, such as social class, social group, or ethnicity. What's important is individual accomplishment and achievement. And what ends up happening in individualistic cultures is that people spend less time with more people. Collectivistic cultures, on the other hand, focus primarily on a person's interdependence within their group. Even the emotions they experience tend to be shared emotions. Marriages and partnerships are often arranged by one social group, usually their family. Social hierarchies, such as respect for elderly or people that are older than you, tend to have a higher importance, and people are very aware of other people's social status. In collectivistic cultures, also, there is a tendency to spend more time in relationships with fewer people. Here's a map of various countries around the world and their levels of collectivism and individualism. And countries that are the darker purple are the ones that are the most individualistic, whereas the lighter colors indicate more collectivist cultures. The United States, Canada, and notably Australia rank in as very individualistic cultures. Thinking about collectivism and individualism in our current pandemic the world is going through, and doing some extra researching and reading for this lecture, I came across an article in the USA Today that really emphasized the differences between different countries and how they've managed to negotiate this pandemic. And I started thinking about how strategies that different countries have taken to handle this pandemic are likely related to where they stand in terms of their collectivism, individualism. Take Taiwan, for example. Taiwan is known to be a collectivistic country, so the focus in that country is more on social groups and the needs of people in the society as being more important than individual needs. They have a population of about 24 million, and since the pandemic started, they haven't experienced any lockdowns nor closures, and life has been fairly regular, except for mandatory wearing of masks while indoors, temperature checks, and mandated contact tracing. In fact, this picture on the bottom right shows an LGBTQ parade in October in Taiwan. And what's really remarkable is that in Taiwan, they've only had about 600 cases since this pandemic began. And even more remarkable is the number of deaths. Only 7 people have died in that entire country of 24 million people from COVID-19. Let's contrast that with Florida, which, as the rest of the United States, tends to have a very individualistic culture. Florida's population is around 21 million, And they have experienced repeated lockdowns, repeated closures. And in contrast to Taiwan, for approximately the same number of people, and actually in a larger geographic area, they've had over 900,000 cases and almost 18,000 deaths as a result of COVID-19. You can see in the picture on the bottom, these are the portable refrigerated morgues that the state is planning to put in various locations to handle the fatalities due to the pandemic. It could be hypothesized that the lower number of COVID-19 infections and deaths in Taiwan could be a result of a greater degree of concern for the needs of other people in the collective or in the culture over individual needs, which would then translate to strict adherence to the rules like wearing masks and participating in mandatory contact tracing and temperature checks. Undoubtedly, there are other variables that help to explain this huge difference in the number of cases and deaths in these two different places with similar populations. But it could be argued that individualism, collectivism could be one of the important factors. And indeed, if you look at this graph on the right, this is a scatter plot of scores for individualism for specific countries plotted against death rates worldwide. And this is earlier in the pandemic before testing had been rolled out. Great Britain, a very individualistic culture, is up at the top right, along with France, as opposed to Japan, which is known to be collectivistic, in the bottom middle. But you'll also see this line of best fit, which is indicating that there's a correlation of 0.75 between the extent that a country is individualistic and the death rate in that country. Why would this be? It could be argued that one of the reasons the death rates are higher and the infection rates are higher in individualistic cultures is that a higher value is placed on the needs of the individual, the need to be able to move about freely, to choose whether or not to wear a mask, etc., versus those of the collective or other people in the culture. And these are having a strong impact on the ability to control the infection rate and the deaths in the country. Collectivistic cultures, because they have more of a focus on the needs of other people, may be best equipped to handle some of the measures that have been proposed and taken by many countries to combat infection and death due to COVID-19. Taiwan in particular has another element in addition to its collectivism that helped citizens to be able to conform to these rules, to these restrictions, and that is that it is more of a vertical culture than a horizontal culture. So here is another ETIC, again proposed by Triandis and Gelfand, that describes how likely individuals in a culture are to be subject to authority figures versus treating each other as equals. In vertical cultures, there is an emphasis on hierarchies. Some members of the culture have much less status than other members of the culture, and there is a strict adherence to following the rules and the orders of people in authority. Taiwan is a vertical culture in that citizens highly respect the authority of their leaders. And in addition, in Taiwan, another thing that helped to enforce those rules is that there were very strict penalties that were placed on individuals if they violated those rules. So there was a high expectation that citizens would respect the authority, and they knew that if they violated the rules, then they would be strictly penalized. Horizontal cultures, on the other hand, view individuals as equal. They value equality. There is not a strong belief that people of lower status in the culture need to respect the authority of those with higher status. And this is an ETIC that can commonly be crossed with the individualist collectivist ETIC. And that's something that Triandis and Gelfand did. Here's some examples of collectivist and individualist cultures that also vary on the vertical-horizontal dimension. First, we have the collectivist vertical culture, and that is a culture like Taiwan or China, where there is a strong emphasis on the needs of the group or the community, but there's also this high respect for authority figures and the belief that people of lower status have less equality and less freedom. That can be contrasted with the collectivist horizontal culture, where there still is a belief that the needs of the group are more important than the individual, but there isn't this huge respect of authority difference. People are all considered to be equal. They're supposed to cooperate with each other and share in the work. And an example of this kind of a culture, collectivistic horizontal culture, is in Israel, particularly in the Israeli kibbutz, where multiple families participate as equals to raise their families. And they cooperate and share all of the responsibilities and the work. Moving towards the individualistic side, the individualistic vertical culture values the individual as more important than the group, but there's also a high respect for authority figures. People are not all equal in the individualistic vertical culture. Now, this is a way that you would describe the United States and also France. Although people have a lot of freedom to do what they want, they also are expected to conform to the rules of authority and law and face repercussions if they don't do that. Last, we have the individualistic horizontal culture, and that shares that individualistic belief that the needs of the individual are more important than the needs of the group. And there's also high freedom for individuals to do what they want to do, to pursue their own accomplishments. But there's also a belief in people in the culture as being equals. And there's almost a really strong disregard for people who tend to be braggarts or to show off their status. And a country that is an example of this kind of a culture that shows the mix of individualism and being horizontal is Norway. Just to summarize, individualistic vertical cultures, like the United States and France, individual freedom and achievement is valued, and actually being number one is really the goal, because status is really important in the individualistic vertical culture. Contrast that with the individualistic horizontal culture. Australia, Sweden, Norway, status is less important, and there's an emphasis on individuals need to be autonomous and self-reliant, but a very strong disregard for people who are show-offs or braggarts. The collectivist vertical culture, again, like we would see in Taiwan or Korea or China and Japan, that there is an interdependence between members because the needs of the group are more important, but there's also this desire to share mutual respect and harmony. But at the same time, it's really important to defer to the strong authority figures and to obey the rules of the culture. Last, we have the collectivist horizontal culture, and again, that's like the Israeli kibbutz. There's less emphasis on maintaining the harmony and the status of groups, but there's more emphasis on members of a culture cooperating and sharing in equality.